The Farmall M died at the worst possible moment. Tom Hendricks was halfway through his wheat field, spring plowing deadline just 3 days away, when the tractor that had never failed him in 35 years suddenly coughed, shuddered, and quit, dead, just like that. Tom sat there in the cold March wind, staring at the instrument panel. This wasn't a belt or a tire. The engine had simply stopped running, and he had no idea why. Fresh oil 2 weeks ago, clean fuel in the tank, spark plugs good, everything maintained exactly like his father had done since buying this machine new in 1948. He climbed down and tried the starter. The engine turned over strong, caught for maybe 5 seconds, then died. 3 more tries, same result. Tom felt something cold in his gut. He had 200 acres to plow before planting, a banknote due in 6 weeks, and his main tractor was dead for reasons he couldn't figure out. Worse than that, his neighbor Frank Morrison's John Deere was doing the same thing. And Charlie Webb's Alice down the road, 3 different tractors, 3 different farms, all suddenly failing with identical symptoms. Something had changed and nobody knew what. Tom spent 2 days tearing into the Farmall, 40 years of fixing equipment, and he couldn't diagnose this. Clean fuel, good spark, perfect compression. Carburetor jets clear. The tractor should run, but it wouldn't stay running more than 20 minutes before the power loss started again. On the 3rd day, with his planting window shrinking and panic starting to set in, Tom called his son David at the State University. David was studying agricultural engineering. Maybe he'd seen something like this. David came home that weekend and spent 10 minutes looking at the tractor before he said, "Dad, when did you buy fuel last?" "February, Johnson Station, same as always." "Did they change anything?" Tom thought about it. "New underground tanks, EPA regulation, what's that matter?" "Everything." David pulled out a textbook. "The fuel changed, Dad. Modern gasoline doesn't have lead anymore. This engine was designed for leaded fuel. The lead lubricated your valves. Without it, the exhaust valves are wearing out. Plus, modern fuel has ethanol that dissolves old rubber. Your fuel lines are probably disintegrating inside." Tom stared at his son. "Every tractor built before 1970 is just done because the fuel changed. Unless you convert them, yeah." Tom had 4 tractors, all between 1942 and 1958. Maybe $15,000 in equipment that had worked perfectly until last month. He couldn't afford to replace it. He could barely afford his land payment. "What's it cost to fix?" $300 in parts per tractor if you do the work. More if you wait and the valves fail completely. Then you're looking at machine shop work, maybe $1,500. Tom felt sick. 300 times 4 tractors was $1,200 he didn't have. But what choice did he have? Let the equipment die. He'd built his whole operation around these paid-off machines. "Show me what needs replacing." They worked all weekend converting the Farmall's fuel system. New synthetic fuel lines that felt wrong in Tom's hands, stiff and chemical instead of the original rubber. Modern composite gaskets instead of cork. Everything had to be replaced because ethanol dissolved the old materials. When they finished, Tom mixed fuel additive into fresh gas and hit the starter. The Farmall caught and settled into its familiar idle. He opened the throttle. The engine responded clean and strong. No stuttering, no power loss. 20 minutes at full throttle. Perfect. Tom felt relief, then immediate anger. $300 and an entire weekend because someone in Washington changed the fuel. He still had 3 more tractors to convert, and spring planting was already behind schedule. The banknote was due in 4 weeks. Tom worked every spare hour converting his other tractors. The work went faster as he learned the process, but time was burning away. He fell behind on plowing, had to hire help he couldn't afford to catch up. The costs kept mounting while his planting window kept shrinking. His neighbor Earl Patterson stopped by while Tom was working on his 3rd tractor. Earl was 68, stubborn as granite, and his 1947 Ford was running rough. "Heard you're tearing apart perfectly good tractors," Earl said. "Fuel change," Tom explained. "Ethanol's eating the rubber. Unleaded's wearing the valves. You need to convert or it'll fail." Earl shook his head. "My Ford ran 36 years without problems. It'll keep running. This is nonsense." "Earl, I'm telling you." "I've heard enough." Earl walked back to his truck. Tom watched him leave and felt a knot of worry. Earl was farming on even thinner margins than Tom. If that Ford died, Earl was finished. 2 weeks later, Tom was finishing his wheat planting when he saw Earl's wife drive past toward town, moving fast. That evening, Tom heard what happened. Earl's Ford had quit completely, missing so bad it couldn't pull itself. Earl had tried to keep working, pushing the sick tractor harder, and the engine had finally just stopped. When the mechanic pulled the head, the exhaust valves had pounded nearly a quarter-inch into the soft valve seats. The compression was gone. The engine was finished. Hardened valve seat installation would cost $1,100. Earl didn't have $1,100. Earl took a loan from the bank. The first time he'd borrowed money in 20 years. Tom heard Earl had considered scrapping the Ford, but he couldn't farm without it. The loan plus the repair costs put Earl so far behind, he'd be lucky to break even this year. The story spread through the county like wildfire. Suddenly, every farmer with vintage equipment was panicking. The parts stores couldn't keep ethanol-resistant fuel line in stock. Machine shops were booked months out. Tom watched neighbors scrambling, some spending money they didn't have, others just hoping their equipment would last one more season. 3 weeks before harvest, Tom's converted tractors were running perfectly. The Farmall M purred like it had 20 years ago. His wheat looked good, the best stand he'd had in 5 years. If the weather held and harvest went smooth, he'd make his note payment with maybe $500 to spare. Then the carburetor on his 1952 John Deere started flooding. Tom felt his stomach drop. He'd converted that tractor's fuel system 2 months ago, used all new parts, done everything right. It shouldn't be having problems. He pulled the carburetor and found the float had absorbed ethanol and sunk. The float was made from some kind of composite material that the parts supplier had sworn was ethanol-proof. It wasn't. Fuel was flooding into the intake manifold, washing oil off the cylinder walls. If Tom had kept running it, the engine would have scored the cylinders. A new brass float cost $75 and would take a week to arrive. Tom had the John Deere down for baling hay in 6 days. Without it, he'd miss his window to get the hay in before rain. Wet hay meant mold. Moldy hay meant worthless feed. He'd lose $3,000 in hay value. Tom called every parts store within 50 miles. Nobody had a brass float for a 1952 Deere in stock. He finally found one at a tractor salvage yard 120 miles away. The guy wanted $90 and wouldn't ship it. Tom had to drive down there himself, 4 hours round trip in the middle of wheat harvest. He left at 5 in the morning, got the part, drove back and installed it by 3 that afternoon. The Deere fired up and ran perfectly. Tom headed straight to the hayfield and started baling. He worked until midnight under tractor lights, got the hay in just before a rainstorm rolled through the next morning. Tom sat in his kitchen drinking coffee and watching the rain, knowing he'd just barely made it. If that float had failed 2 days later, he'd have lost the hay. If the salvage yard hadn't had the part, he'd have lost the hay. His margin for error had shrunk to nothing because of problems he'd never had to think about before. The fuel situation had turned farming into a minefield. Every vintage tractor was a potential crisis waiting to happen. Modern components that were supposed to be ethanol-proof sometimes weren't. Parts that should have been available weren't. Problems appeared without warning at the worst possible moments. Tom started keeping non-ethanol fuel on hand when he could find it, even though it cost 50 cents more per gallon. He ordered spare parts for critical components and kept them on the shelf. He learned to check fuel system parts before busy seasons instead of waiting for failures. The old way of maintaining equipment, fixing things when they broke, didn't work anymore. Harvest came and went. Tom made his note payment with $340 left over. Not the $500 he'd hoped for, but enough. The converted tractors had performed well once he'd solved the float problem. His wheat yield was good. He'd survived another year. Earl Patterson wasn't so lucky. The loan payment plus a dry spell that cut his yield meant Earl finished the year $4,000 in debt. Tom heard Earl was thinking about selling out, retiring early. 40 years of farming ended because a 1947 Ford tractor couldn't handle modern fuel and Earl hadn't known to fix it in time. Winter came. Tom's Farmall M sat in the barn, converted and ready for spring work. The tractor looked identical to the day his father drove it home in 1948, but underneath it had been completely rebuilt for a different world. New fuel lines, synthetic gaskets, hardened valve seats, brass carburetor float, timing advanced 4 degrees. Tom walked out to the barn on a January morning and fired up the Farmall. It caught on the first compression and settled into that familiar idle. He let it warm up, then drove out to move round bales for the cattle. The engine pulled strong and smooth, 40 years old and still working like new. 3 hours later, Tom shut down the Farmall and headed back to the house for lunch. The tractor sat in the snow, engine ticking as it cooled. Tomorrow he'd grease the fittings, check the oil, clean the air filter. Same maintenance his father had done for 35 years. The difference was, Tom had nearly lost this machine because fuel chemistry changed, and he didn't know it in time. He'd spent $1,200 converting 4 tractors, driven 240 miles for a $75 part, and watched his neighbor go into debt because of the same problem. But the Farmall was still running. That was what mattered. Thank you for watching this video. If you found this story valuable, please subscribe to our channel, give us a like, and share it with others who appreciate agricultural history and vintage equipment wisdom. Your support helps us continue preserving these important stories from America's farming heritage. This video is inspired by real events and the genuine experiences of American farmers during the transition from leaded to unleaded gasoline in the 1970s and 80s. The information presented about fuel chemistry, engine modifications, and equipment challenges reflects documented historical facts and authentic agricultural practices. Tom Hendricks is a representative character who reflects the experiences of hundreds of American farmers who faced similar situations during this era. This content is not intended to represent or offend any specific individual or organization.